The morning fog clung to Provincetown Harbor like a shroud, when Harbor Master Jake Morrison received the call that would resurrect a 5-year-old nightmare. A fishing vessel had been spotted drifting aimlessly 3 miles off Race Point, its engine silent, no distress signals, no signs of life. "It's the Sarah's Dream," came the crackling voice over the radio from Coast Guard Petty Officer Chen. "Registration checks out. Jake, this is the Henley boat." Morrison's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the dock planks. The Henley family, Tom, Sarah, and their 12-year-old son Marcus, had vanished without a trace 5 years ago during what should have been a routine fishing trip. The Coast Guard had searched for weeks. The case had gone cold, leaving behind only questions and a community haunted by loss. Now their boat had returned, as if summoned from the depths by some unseen force. "The investigation begins, Doctor." Elena Vasquez, a maritime forensics expert from Boston, arrived within hours of the discovery. The Coast Guard had towed the Sarah's Dream to a secured dock, treating it as both a crime scene and a potential hazard. What they found defied explanation. The boat was in pristine condition, too pristine. Despite 5 years presumably adrift, there was no significant marine growth, no rust, no deterioration that should have occurred. The engine, while currently silent, showed signs of recent maintenance. Most disturbing of all, personal items remained exactly where they should be. Sarah's reading glasses on the navigation table, Marcus's fishing rod secured in its holder, Tom's lucky hat hanging on its usual peg. But there were no people, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Detective Ray Santos of the Massachusetts State Police had worked the original missing persons case. Now in his final year before retirement, he found himself pulled back into the mystery that had defined the latter part of his career. "It's like they just stepped off the boat 5 minutes ago," Santos muttered, examining the galley where a can of soda sat on the counter, still cold to the touch. "But that's impossible." Dr. Vasquez ran her gloved hand along the boat's railing. "Ray, look at this." She pointed to the wood grain. "See how the varnish catches the light? This boat has been maintained. Recently." Flashback. 5 years earlier. The story shifted to that fateful morning in September 2019. Tom Henley, a third-generation fisherman, had planned a father-son bonding trip with Marcus. Sarah, a marine biologist who studied local ecosystems, decided to join them to collect water samples for her research on unusual algae blooms that had been appearing off the Cape. The family was well known in Provincetown. Tom operated a small but successful charter business. Sarah taught at the Cape Cod Community College, and Marcus was the kind of kid who knew every lobsterman by name and could tie nautical knots in his sleep. Their last confirmed sighting was at 6:47 a.m. when they departed Provincetown Harbor. Tom had filed a float plan, indicating they would be fishing the waters around Stellwagen Bank and would return by 4 p.m. By 6 p.m., when they failed to return, Sarah's sister called the Coast Guard. The search began immediately. Helicopters, cutters, and local fishing vessels combed the waters. The weather had been perfect. Clear skies, light winds, calm seas. There was no reason for the Sarah's Dream to encounter trouble, yet they had simply vanished. The witnesses come forward news of the boat's return spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Within days, people began coming forward with stories they had been too afraid to tell 5 years earlier. Martha Delacroix, who ran the bait shop, revealed that Tom had seemed unusually nervous that morning. He kept checking his watch, kept looking out at the water like he was expecting something. She told Detective Santos. "When I asked if everything was okay, he just said they had to be at a specific location by 8:30. That struck me as odd. Tom never fished by the clock." Carlos Mendoza, a charter captain, admitted he had seen something unusual that September morning. "I was about 2 miles southwest of Race Point when I saw this weird light under the water, bright white moving in a perfect circle, lasted maybe 30 seconds, then just gone." He had never reported it because he was afraid people would think he was crazy. Most chilling was the account from teenage Emma Walsh, who had been on the beach that morning with her metal detector. She claimed to have seen the Sarah's Dream in the distance, but then it seemed to shimmer and disappear like a mirage. "I thought I was seeing things," Emma told Dr. Vasquez, "but I remember thinking it looked like the boat was sinking into the air instead of water." The scientific investigation, Dr. Vasquez's team subjected the Sarah's Dream to extensive analysis. What they discovered challenged conventional understanding. The boat's hull showed traces of an unknown metallic substance, microscopically thin but detectable under spectrographic analysis. The metal didn't match any known alloy in databases, and it seemed to have properties that defied physics. It was simultaneously present and not present, depending on the angle of observation. Water samples from the boat's bilge contained organisms that shouldn't exist in North Atlantic waters. Under microscopic examination, Dr. Vasquez found what appeared to be bioluminescent plankton, but with cellular structures unlike anything in marine biology textbooks. These organisms, she explained to a increasingly troubled Detective Santos, appear to be engineered, not evolved, designed. The boat's electronics told another impossible story. The GPS unit showed a continuous track over the past 5 years, but not across Earth's oceans. The coordinates didn't correspond to any location on the planet. The radio had been transmitting, but on frequencies that didn't exist in human communications. Most disturbing was the boat's compass, which spun wildly when activated, unable to find magnetic north. The town's dark history research into Provincetown's maritime records revealed a pattern that had been overlooked or suppressed. Every 50 to 60 years, dating back to the 1800s, fishing vessels would vanish from the same general area where the Henleys disappeared. Sometimes the boats would return years later, empty and pristine. Sometimes they never returned at all. Local historian Margaret Thornfield had documented these incidents in her personal journals, but had never published her findings. People don't want to hear about curses and mysteries, she told Dr. Vasquez. They want tourism and fish prices. The pattern was undeniable. 1847. The merchant vessel, Providence, vanished with 12 souls aboard, returned empty 3 years later, 1903. Fishing boat Mary Catherine disappeared, found drifting and empty after 18 months, 1962. The lobster boat Atlantic Dream vanished with 2 brothers, never returned. Each incident occurred during specific oceanic conditions, unusual tide patterns, specific alignments of underwater currents, and what old-timers called the calling waters. Margaret's research suggested the disappearances were connected to an underwater geological formation known as the Provincetown Trench, a deep-water canyon that extended far below the continental shelf. Officially, the trench was mapped and understood. Unofficially, its deepest regions had never been successfully explored. The underwater discovery. Using the GPS coordinates from the Sarah's Dreams Impossible Journey, Dr. Vasquez convinced the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to conduct a deep-water survey of the Provincetown Trench. What they found changed everything. At a depth of 200 feet, in a section of the trench that should have been empty water and sediment, sonar detected a massive structure. The initial images were unclear, but as the remotely operated vehicle descended, the truth became undeniable. There was a city on the ocean floor, not ruins. An active, functioning city with lights, movement, and what appeared to be a harbor filled with vessels from different eras. The architecture was unlike anything human, featuring flowing organic curves that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Among the vessels docked in the impossible harbor was a fishing boat that matched the description of the Atlantic Dream, missing since 1962. Jesus Christ, whispered the NOAA technician operating the ROV. There are people moving around down there. The camera focused on figures walking along what appeared to be streets or pathways. They were humanoid but moved with an odd, flowing gait. When one of the figures looked up at the camera, its eyes reflected the ROV's lights like a cat's, but with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. The figure raised what might have been a hand in greeting, and the ROV's electronics immediately began to malfunction. The first contact. That night, Dr. Vasquez dreamed of drowning, but the water was filled with light and she could breathe. In the dream, she found herself standing on the deck of the Sarah's Dream, but the boat was sailing through an ocean of stars rather than water. Tom Henley stood at the wheel looking exactly as he had 5 years ago. "You found us," he said simply. "Where are you?" Elena asked in the dream. "Between," Tom replied. "Between what was and what will be. Between the surface and the deep. Between your world and theirs." Sarah Henley emerged from the cabin still wearing the same clothes she had disappeared in. "We're ambassadors now," she said. "The first, but not the last." Marcus appeared beside his parents, but he seemed older, changed. His eyes held the same reflective quality Elena had seen in the figure on the ocean floor. "They've been waiting so long," he said, "waiting for the right time, the right people to help them return to the surface." Elena woke with the taste of salt water in her mouth and bioluminescent algae under her fingernails. The town prepares word of the underwater discovery spread. despite attempts to keep it classified. Provincetown found itself at the center of international attention as marine biologists, government officials, and conspiracy theorists descended on the small coastal community. The townspeople reacted with a mixture of excitement and terror. Some, like Martha Delacroix, began stocking up on supplies and talking about evacuation. Others, including several of the local fishermen, seemed strangely calm, as if they had been expecting this revelation. "My grandfather always said the ocean had its own people," said lobsterman Frank Silva. "Said you could hear them singing on foggy nights if you knew how to listen." Detective Santos found himself coordinating between federal agencies, scientists, and increasingly panicked local officials. The Coast Guard had established a perimeter around the area where the Sarah's Dream had been found, but strange reports continued to come in from fishermen and recreational boaters. Boats were reporting equipment malfunctions in the area. Compasses spun wildly. Fish finders showed impossible readings. Schools of fish swimming in formation, arranged in geometric patterns. Radio communications became garbled, filled with what sounded like whale songs but with an underlying rhythm that suggested language. The message 3. Days after the underwater city's discovery, every radio, television, and electronic device in Provincetown began broadcasting the same signal simultaneously. It wasn't quite music and wasn't quite speech, but somehow everyone understood its meaning. The beings in the underwater city, who called themselves the Abyssal, had been the ocean's guardians for millennia. Climate change, pollution, and overfishing had pushed them to the brink of action. They had been selecting humans to serve as intermediaries, to help their two species coexist rather than face an inevitable conflict. The Henley family had been chosen because of their deep connection to the sea. Tom's family had fished these waters for generations. Sarah's research had shown genuine concern for marine ecosystems. Marcus represented the future, young enough to adapt, old enough to understand. They were alive, but changed, enhanced. They could breathe both air and water, could withstand the pressure of the deep ocean, and could communicate with the Abyssal. They had spent 5 years learning, preparing for this moment when the two worlds would have to acknowledge each other. The message continued. More families would be chosen, not taken against their will, but invited to bridge the gap between surface and depth. The ocean was dying, and desperate times required unprecedented cooperation. The choice. As federal authorities debated whether to treat the situation as first contact or an act of war, the Sarah's Dream began moving again. With no one aboard, the boat left its secure berth and headed back out to sea, broadcasting coordinates to anyone willing to listen. Dr. Vasquez found herself standing on the dock at midnight, watching the boat's lights disappear into the darkness. Around her, a dozen other Provincetown residents had gathered, all of them hearing the same call she felt in her bones. The water around the dock began to glow with bioluminescence, and shapes moved beneath the surface. Large shapes, graceful and alien, but somehow welcoming. Detective Santos approached, his service weapon holstered, but his hand resting on its grip. "Dr. Vasquez, step away from the water." She turned to face him, and he saw that her eyes had begun to reflect the dock lights. "They're not our enemies, Ray. They're our partners. The ocean is dying, and they're offering us a chance to save it together. By taking our people, by inviting us to evolve." Other townspeople were entering the water now, walking into the glowing sea without fear. As they submerged, their forms began to change, becoming more streamlined, more adapted to their new environment. Santos drew his weapon, but found he couldn't bring himself to fire. These weren't victims, they were volunteers. And deep down, a part of him that had spent decades living by the sea understood the choice they were making, the new reality. 6 months later, Provincetown had become a unique community where humans and the Abyssal worked together. The fishing industry had been transformed. Instead of depleting the ocean's resources, fishermen worked with the sea's guardians to maintain sustainable populations and restore damaged ecosystems. The Henley family returned to the surface regularly, serving as ambassadors and teachers. Marcus, now calling himself by an abyssal name that translated roughly to Bridgewalker, helped other children adapt to their new dual nature. Sarah's research had expanded beyond anything she had previously imagined, studying biology that operated on principles unknown to surface science. Tom continued to fish, but now he could dive to depths impossible for normal humans and work alongside creatures that had been guardians of the deep for longer than human civilization had existed. Dr. Vasquez had made her choice on that midnight dock. and now served as the primary scientific liaison between the two species. Her work documenting the transformation had become the foundation for a new field of study, one that bridged marine biology, anthropology, and what could only be called xenobiology. Detective Santos remained on the surface, serving as a protective buffer between the transformed community and outside authorities who still viewed the situation with suspicion and fear. But he wore a small device around his neck that allowed him to breathe underwater for short periods, and he often found himself swimming with beings that had once been his neighbors. The continuing mystery, the Sarah's Dream, continued to patrol the waters off Cape Cod, sometimes with its original family aboard, sometimes crewed by other bridgewalkers, sometimes sailing empty as a symbol of the choice that remained open to others. Not everyone made the transformation. Many Provincetown residents chose to remain fully human, and their choice was respected. But they lived in a community forever changed, where the boundary between land and sea had become permeable. Similar incidents began occurring in coastal communities around the world. The Abyssal revealed that they had been preparing for this emergence for decades, selecting locations where humans had maintained the strongest connections to the ocean. The governments of the world struggled to develop policies for a situation that had no precedent. How do you regulate citizens who can breathe underwater and communicate with beings older than recorded history? How do you maintain sovereignty over territorial waters when those waters are inhabited by guardians who predate human civilization? But in Provincetown, at least, a working model had emerged. The town had become a place where two species learned to coexist, where the health of the ocean was no longer just an environmental concern, but a shared responsibility. Epilogue. The next generation. 5 years after the return of the Sarah's Dream, children in Provincetown learned to swim before they could walk. Some were fully human, some were transformed, and some represented something new, a generation born from the union of surface and depth. These children could breathe air or water with equal ease. They could withstand pressure that would crush normal humans, but they could also thrive in the bright, dry world above the waves. They represented the future that the Abyssal had envisioned, not the replacement of one species by another, but the evolution of both into something greater. The ocean around Cape Cod was healthier than it had been in over a century. Fish populations had stabilized and grown. The water was cleaner. The mysterious algae blooms that had once concerned scientists like Sarah Henley had been revealed as a form of abyssal agriculture, cultivating organisms that helped filter pollutants from the sea. And sometimes, on foggy mornings, residents of Provincetown could see other boats drifting just beyond the harbor, vessels from decades or centuries past, their crews having made the same choice as the Henley family, serving as eternal guardians of the boundary between worlds. The Sarah's Dream still sailed those waters, a reminder that some disappearances are not tragedies but transformations, and that the sea, which had given birth to all life on Earth, was not ready to let that life die without a fight. The mystery of the vanished fishing family had been solved, but it had been replaced by a greater mystery, the question of what humanity might become when it finally accepted that it was not alone on this blue planet, and that the ocean's depths held not just fish and water, but intelligence, wisdom, and a partnership that could save both species from the consequences of a dying world. In the end, the Henley family hadn't vanished at all. They had simply been the first to answer a call that had been echoing from the depths for generations, waiting for the right moment when the surface world was ready to listen. And in the harbor of Provincetown, where fishing boats bobbed alongside vessels of impossible design, where children played games that took them from air to water and back again, where the boundary between human and other had become beautifully, mysteriously blurred, the future was being written in bioluminescent letters on the dark canvas of the sea.